He said he was calling a friend. But at 12:03 a.m., I heard him say, "She's standing right behind me." I froze halfway down the hallway, the cheap laminate biting into the soles of my feet like the moment itself had sharp edges. I remember the way the clock blinked, 12:03, how the numbers seemed suddenly accusatory, like a witness to something I was only beginning to understand. He hung up and smiled like nothing happened. That smile is the story I still taste sometimes, a small, ordinary thing that hid an ordinary, catastrophic betrayal. You want to know how a house that used to feel safe became a map of secrets I had to trace with my own hands? Sit with me a while. Imagine that smile, the one that used to mean, "I'm okay," and later came to mean, "I hid this from you." Imagine the way it plastered itself to my son's face when he told me he was just talking to a friend. That night, I didn't march into his room. I stood in the dark and listened until the radio static of the dead house filled my ears and the silence became wordless accusation. I could have gone in, caught him raw, demanded an explanation, but something colder took over, an almost clinical clarity. If I exploded then, I worried I'd be dismissed as a hysterical mother, and the person who'd been quietly rebuilding a life of careful lies would have the perfect story, that I'd lost control, that everything I found was the result of my overreaction. So I waited. Do you ever feel that strange, patient waiting, like a coiled thing, while your mind catalogs everything you know and what you might prove? That waiting is the beginning of justice for me, not the end. Who would you be in my shoes? Would you have barged in screaming or watched, listening, planning? Be honest. Would you have waited this long for payback? My son, Daniel, was 22 and the sort of careful that looks like charm at brunch and like calculation in the dark. He'd grown up with me when his father left the house, left the bills, left a kind of quiet that we decorated with petty triumphs. Good grades, piano recitals, the first paycheck that meant we could eat a little better for a week. I am not a dramatic woman. I do not tell stories about how I raised him alone with poetry. I did it out of stubbornness, teeth set, a job that chewed my time and gave him steady dinners and a place to do homework. He knew how to say thank you when he needed to, how to keep his voice small so it would fit into the tired spaces of our life. That's the part of the memory that wounded me most, the economy of his affection. He learned to ration it. Years later, those small, reserved gestures felt like rehearsed lines. He was polite to guests. He cried discreetly. He smiled for photographs. Nothing about that smile ever suggested it was saving parts of itself for someone else, some secret life. In the days after midnight and the hushed, impossible sentence, "She's standing right behind me," I started noticing things. Little omissions at the dinner table, like he'd scrubbed an entire hour from his day. The way his phone buzzed and he tucked it under his thigh like contraband. The way he answered my questions with mirrors. "Everything okay, Mom?" Then gave me a look that said, "Don't be dramatic." The first betrayal is always small enough to be explained away. He was tired, he was with friends, he had been working late. But secrets metastasize. A month passed and the calls grew later, the laughter on the phone softer, and sometimes full of a strange reverence he reserved for no one in our house. A woman's name started to appear in his texts. Only once at first, slipped between memes and grocery lists. And when I asked, he rolled his eyes and said, "Work friend." Have you ever watched a life you think you own slip like water between your fingers? You try to cup it, to keep the surface taut, and every attempt leaves you more acquainted with the cold, inevitable slide of what it is to be betrayed. When the little clues multiplied into evidence, I did what felt like the only sensible thing. I collected them. I am not proud of what a meticulous person I became, but I learned the language of receipts and timestamps and app notifications the way others learn lullabies. I read through his messages late at night when he slept like the dead, soundless, exhausted, and I learned to decode the things teenagers hide. I found photos he'd thought ephemeral, files tucked away in cloud folders with nicknames and laughter, and the hidden architecture of a life he'd built away from my knowledge. I learned who she was. Claire, 28, an art student with a laugh that, in his photos, blurred the edges of his jaw. She was polite in the group photos, always a hand poised on his arm like a flag marking territory. When I called her, I practiced some ordinary maternal tone and asked, casually, how they met. She said they were study partners. She said she loved the way Daniel explained things. She said, with the kind of airy sincerity that makes you want to smile and shake her hand, he really cares about his family. We all tell ourselves lies like that to keep the world smooth. But the lies were layered. Claire's online presence was full of art and coffee and long sentences about light, but offline, there were messages to my son that were private, intimate, and oddly possessive. I confronted him once, softly at first. "Who is Claire?" I asked over the chopping of vegetables. He said work friend again, and told a story about a group project. I believed him, in the way you sometimes believe people at the time, for convenience, and because you are tired, and because your own need to preserve a functional life is loud. But the seed of doubt had rooted itself, and I could smell the rot even as I stirred the soup. The second confrontation came after a late-night argument when he slammed the door and left his phone on the kitchen counter. I picked it up, not proud of that either, and a text preview lit the screen. "Don't tell your mom about the plan," it read. I swallowed, and suddenly the house felt like a theater with no exits. Plan? For what? Betrayal has its grammar, a hidden verb you can track if you listen long enough. That night I slept with the light on, pretending it was for the television, when really, I wanted the light's steady presence to be a small enemy of the dark thoughts pooling in my head. You have to understand that when betrayal becomes a pattern, it alters the way you think about kindness. You start to catalog gestures. Who is allowed to touch him? Who lingers in photographs? Who always arrives with a smile timed perfectly to eclipse yours? At brunch with my sister, I watched him across the table and saw him in a new way, tilted toward Claire in conversation, eyes bright in a way that had nothing to do with me. The way he talked about his future began to include we's, community, trips, a new apartment, words that should have included me but left me out like a stop in a train itinerary. When I asked him about moving out, he said, "Not now, Mom, I'm saving." But finding receipts for shared apartments, a deposit, a name I didn't know, those were the things that strip you down to essentials. Rage came in private as a hot, controlled thing. I promised myself this would end with dignity. I promised not to reduce myself to someone who storms and screams. I promised to be smarter than the lie. How many times have you told yourself that before you break?
The turning point was not when I found the lease. It was a smaller earthquake. His tone when he said, "You worry too much." It was the casual cruelty of dismissal. I was not only outraged because he'd built a life that excluded me, I was hurt because he had learned to practice a softness that was not for me, a tenderness he gave to someone else that I had once taught him how to practice. That is what made the anger sharp, the theft of my lessons. Remember when you teach someone to tie a tie and then they use the tie to hide their face from you? The revenge I began to plan was not about making him suffer for suffering's sake. It was about reclamation. It was about revealing, carefully, surgically, what had been hidden so that there could be no theater of misunderstanding left when I spoke. People who betray expect you to behave predictably. They expect you to break down, to beg, to forgive on their timetable. So I built a plan that denied them that comfort. My first objective was evidence that could not be gaslit away. I set up a neutral camera in the hallway, an innocuous little thing that looked like a smoke detector. It gave me no voyeuristic thrill. It gave me facts. I recorded conversations, walks in and out, laughter in the stairwell. I wanted to understand not just the what, but the who and the why. What did Claire do in that house to leave imprintable marks? Were there items that traveled from his apartment to ours? I followed small paper trails, a dry cleaner tag on his jacket, a half-used bottle of a shampoo not sold in our usual market, a napkin scribbled with a cafe name. I trailed these clues like ink across white paper until the picture formed. At the same time, I became quiet in my questions, letting him mistake my silence for acceptance. He wanted that reaction. He wanted the freedom of omission. I refused to give it to him. When you play the long game, the moral high ground is often how you keep your balance. Obstacles came like winter storms I could not predict. He noticed me taking more time off work for appointments. He suspected, on some nights, that I was following him. He got defensive, distant. He moved faster with Claire, less careful. Claire started appearing in our neighborhood, oddly casual, as if by coincidence, smiling like a person who is doing performance art in a grocery aisle. My sister told me to drop it, that sons will be sons, that this was how independence looked. My sister's voice was like a balm, and then like a salt rub when she suggested maybe I was being paranoid. The worst betrayal is when your allies decide your pain is inconvenient. I kept my head because the plan needed me whole. I could not let their disbelief become my undoing. As evidence mounted, I began to strategize the reveal. I would not ambush him in anger. I would present him with a mirror so clear he could not blink away his reflection. The plan had 3 parts: expose the hidden apartment and the financial lies, reveal the emotional theft, the conversations and the affection, and create a moment where our extended family would witness the truth so he could not pretend it was a melodramatic fantasy concocted by a desperate mother. For the first part, I coordinated with a friend who ran a local estate agency, someone I trusted to verify the lease and the deposit dates. For the second part, I compiled the recordings into a chronological file, his messages, his voice notes, the one where he said, "She's standing right behind me," clipped and timestamped over and over until the words were undeniable. For the third part, I arranged a family dinner under the guise of a belated birthday, an ordinary celebratory thing that would gather everyone I needed in one room. Plain rituals are the most effective covers because they ground people in expectation. If you want to drop a bomb, put it in a cake. On the day I executed the plan, my stomach was a steady drum of nerves. I remember placing the recorded files on a flash drive, feeling their weight, a cold little thing that carried the evidence of a season-long theft. I rehearsed my voice like a prayer, calm, precise, devoid of theatricality. I wore my face like an instrument, tuned, because the last thing I wanted was to be consumed by my own emotions mid-reveal. When the family assembled, the house hummed with the familiar noise of forks and small talk. Daniel was there, bright and careful, in a shirt that now looked theatrical to me. Claire was not invited, of course not, but the hole where she should have been felt like a presence. I started by thanking everyone for coming and then said something banal about my own forgetfulness of age. People laughed. I slid the flash drive into the laptop and, with a little refusal to be dramatic, played the first clip. It was mundane at first, his voice asking for directions, a laugh. Then it was the midnight call, the phrase I had heard that began this whole unraveling. "She's standing right behind me." The room shifted. You could feel its center move slightly, like a tectonic plate tilting. My sister squeezed my hand, and for the first time in months, I felt understood. What followed was not the cinematic collapse I had imagined when I planned it in the stillness of nights. It was worse, or maybe worse is the wrong word. It was more real. Daniel's face lost color in layers. He stammered, tried to make a joke that landed badly, then tried to explain. Mom said, voice small, "It's not what you think." But the timeline and the receipts and the messages were arranged like a nervous surgeon's instruments, precise, and there was no place left for "not what you think." Family members shifted in their chairs, exchanging looks that resembled something like disappointment and something like betrayal of their own. He tried to apologize, to glibly say he'd been unsure how to tell us. There is an ugliness in apologies when they are cheap and rehearsed. Claire's image in photos, the messages, the lease, these were not theatrical props he could shove into the narrative of a confused youth. The weight of evidence has a peculiar moral gravity. The climax came not in a shout, but in a small human collapse. He stood up, stunned, and left through the back door with nothing but the jacket he'd been wearing. The silence he left behind was the loudest sound I have ever heard. Later, he called from a payphone. "Do you remember those?" And I listened to his voice, diminished, apologetic, and strangely, in that small brokenness, I felt a relief. The revenge did not make him small. The exposure made our family real again. People have asked me whether I wanted to humiliate him. The answer is no. I wanted truth to be the foundation of the next house we would build together, if there was to be a next house. If you had been watching me, you would have seen the relief settle in my shoulders, like someone taking off a heavy coat. But relief is not the same as joy. I was not dancing. I was a woman who had regained her footing and taken a necessary step. There were consequences. Daniel moved out. He and I did not talk for months. He blocked me on every social platform as if erasure could undo the facts. Some in the family were angry at my methods. They insisted that I had entangled privacy and that I'd acted like a spy. Others thanked me in small, quiet ways for ending the deception. Claire's name became something said in a different voice, the kind people use for unpleasant weather. Over time, conversations once shunted away came back into the light because we couldn't pretend we didn't know. We began to negotiate what it meant to be a family with boundaries and truths instead of polite fiction. In the end, the story the house tells now is one of careful repair. I do not pretend we are a tidy success. Daniel and I came back to each other slowly, like two people who had fallen into different rooms of the same building, and decided to learn the stairways again. He apologized more honestly later when the performance was gone and the consequences had settled into the quiet. He told me he had been ashamed, that he had been trying to grow a private life he feared would be judged, and that ashamedness had fermented into secrecy. I told him I understood shame and that hiding makes simple things complicated. We did not erase the past. We sat with it, like an old photograph. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd barged into that hallway at 12:03 and accused him on the spot. Maybe we would have had a different pain, quicker, louder, but not necessarily less devastating. Maybe the slow method I chose, the one that felt like cruelty at times, allowed us a clearer map out.
People ask, was it worth it? The truth is, revenge was never the point. If I am honest, what I wanted was to protect the muscle memory of our home, the routines, the trust, the small morning cups of tea we shared. I wanted my son to learn that honesty is not just a convenience, it is a currency that buys you freedom from the stories other people tell about you. I wanted to make sure he could not build a life of halves and expect the people who loved him to sign off on it. If you think about it, sometimes the most merciful revenge is the one that forces someone to confront what they have done and gives them a chance to be better. That is not a kind of cruelty. It is a hard, necessary medicine. So if you ever hear a phrase in the dark that makes your bones rearrange, if you ever find a secret that smells like smoke, know that patience is a tool and clarity is your ally. You do not have to become a prosecutor of lives to seek the truth. You have to be brave enough to insist on it. Would you have waited? I cannot know. I only know that when I finally spoke, the words I chose were measured, and the life that followed was steadier. I am still awake sometimes in the small hours, thinking of the moment I heard him say, "She's standing right behind me." Those words taught me what my silence could do when it was deliberate and what my voice could do when it was prepared. They taught me that being a mother is sometimes about holding someone accountable and sometimes about holding them while they learn to be a person who can be trusted. And that, in the end, felt like a strange kind of mercy. It's strange how silence can feel heavier than shouting. Weeks passed before I heard his voice again, and when it finally came, it was filtered through the most ordinary sound in the world, my phone buzzing on the kitchen counter while I was rinsing dishes. I remember freezing, hands wet, staring at the screen like it might burn me. Daniel calling. I didn't answer on the first ring, maybe not on the second. But on the third, something soft overrode my pride. I hit accept. "Hi, Mom." His voice was quieter, cautious, like someone testing ice before stepping out. That alone cracked something inside me. I expected anger or excuses, but there was none. Just that hesitant politeness that used to come after he'd scraped his knees as a boy. We talked about nothing. The weather, work, whether the cat was still alive. When the call ended, I stared at the phone and realized I was shaking. I had wanted this.
for him to come back, but wanting and being ready are not the same thing. Over the next few weeks, the calls became small, regular bridges. Texts about errands, pictures of food he'd cooked badly. Every message came with the same undercurrent. Can we pretend we still know how to talk? I tried to answer with kindness, but not surrender. I didn't want to erase what had happened. I wanted to build something new that could hold the weight of truth. The first time we met in person again was in a cafe halfway between our neighborhoods. It was the kind of neutral ground that doesn't belong to anyone. Bright lights, background chatter, no ghosts. He looked older, even though only a few months had passed. The boyish charm was replaced with something uncertain, like he'd been learning humility the hard way. He offered to pay. I let him. It was his way of saying, I know I took something from you, and I want to give something back. For a while, we just sat there, both avoiding the one subject that lived in the room with us. Then he said quietly, I don't blame you for what you did. I looked at him and saw the sincerity in his eyes. I said, you shouldn't. You made me choose between pretending and surviving. He nodded, looking down at his cup. I didn't realize how far I was drifting until you showed me. That was the first real apology, not rehearsed, not designed to fix things in one sentence, just an acknowledgement of damage. After that, we started meeting once a week, sometimes at my house, sometimes near his new apartment. He told me about work, about classes, about trying to rebuild from the embarrassment of what had happened. I told him about the things I'd been doing to fill the empty space he left. We didn't rush forgiveness. We built it one awkward coffee at a time. One evening, he came by the house unannounced. I opened the door, and he was holding an old photo album, one we used to look through when he was little. He said, I thought maybe we could go through this together. The album smelled faintly of dust and dish soap. We sat on the couch and flipped through pictures. Birthdays, graduations, our cat curled on his homework. Each photo was a small truce. At some point, he said, I still don't understand why you didn't just scream at me that night. I smiled a little, because I wanted you to hear yourself, not my anger. He nodded, and there was quiet respect in his face. Weeks turned into months, and the tension softened. I still caught myself checking the clock at night, remembering that 12:03 a.m. moment, but it no longer hurt. It only reminded me of how fragile honesty can be. The last piece of reconciliation came unexpectedly. He asked if he could bring Claire by. I felt my heart tighten, but I said yes. She arrived nervous, polite, holding a small bouquet of lilies. She apologized, honestly, clumsily, and said she had never meant to turn him against me. I could tell she was telling the truth, or at least her version of it. I accepted the flowers and told her I hope they both learned something from what happened. After they left, I stood by the window watching them walk away together, still talking quietly. There was a strange peace in knowing that the story had finally run out of secrets. Now, when I think about revenge, it doesn't taste sharp anymore. It feels like a necessary doorway we both had to walk through. He learned what truth costs. I learned that exposing a lie isn't the end of love, it's the beginning of an honest one. If you'd been there that night when the phone rang again at 12:03, you'd have heard me answer without fear, because this time, it was just my son calling to say goodnight. Sometimes I think about how easily small choices become turning points. One night, one overheard sentence, one decision not to burst into someone's room. If I had shouted instead of listening, I might have ended up with the same facts, but none of the understanding. Waiting gave me space to see the difference between punishment and truth. Daniel and I still carry what happened, but we carry it lightly now. The strange thing about forgiveness is that it doesn't erase the past, it just loosens its grip. When we talk, I still hear the echo of the old silence between us, yet now it feels like background music instead of static. He asks me about my day, tells me about his own, and when we hang up, there's no longer that flicker of guilt or suspicion, just the ordinary warmth of a son saying goodnight to his mother. I keep the flash drive locked away, not as a threat or souvenir, but as a reminder of how close love and pain can sit together. It reminds me that honesty isn't guaranteed, it's something we keep choosing. I think that's what families are, people who learn over and over to choose honesty even when it costs them comfort. Every once in a while, when I'm awake past midnight and the house creaks the way it used to, I remember the voice that started it all, and I smile a little. Not in triumph, but in quiet relief. The story that began with fear ends in understanding. Maybe that's all the revenge I ever needed, to live in a home where secrets don't survive the light, and where both of us finally sleep through the night.